So today we are talking about anxiety, and let's get it started. When traumatic events become disconnected from their source, as is the case in any trauma happening in infancy, they begin to take on a life of their own. For example, a child waiting for his mother to pick him up from school begins to feel anxious when she is late. He doesn't associate the anxiety with the fact that once a long time ago, his first mother disappeared, never to be seen again. He just knows that he becomes more and more anxious until he begins to feel panicky. Most adoptees' symptoms take on a life of their own because they were too young to remember the original precipitating event. However, because trauma itself produces amnesia surrounding the event, even those children who were old enough to remember the separation will seldom connect it to their panic about mothers being late to pick them up from school or a baseball practice. For this reason, being late is a grave offense against adoptees. Oh my God, I cannot tell you how much being late, whether it's myself being late or being picked up for whatever reason, is so much anxiety. Now, yes, I know not only adoptees deal with this, but I've always lived by the notion that if you're not 15 minutes early, you are late. Okay? That is because I have high anxiety when it comes to this. So yes, it very much is. And my mother, my adoptive mother, very much is oh, don't worry, we'll be there in X amount of time, you're fine, it's okay to be 10 minutes late, and I'm just like, no. I love her, but that drives me crazy. I'm just saying. Anyway. It is important for adoptees to understand the amnesia aspect of trauma before they get angry at their birth mothers for not remembering exactly what day they were born or the events surrounding the birth and surrender. Many birth mothers begin being traumatized themselves by the separation from their babies, have very hazy memories of the birth and the days following the event. Even if the connection is made cognitively, the intellectual understanding for the anxiety doesn't always do away with the fearful feelings. That's because the reptilian brain is in charge of the responses to trauma. The reptilian brain acts nanoseconds before the neocortex, which could add reason to the mix. The reptilian brain is the survival brain, in charge of the 4 F's: flight, freeze, and reproduction. Or fawn is really the other F, just saying. In one's response to one of these messages before one can think, difficulties often arise. Now again, just mentioning it, I do post shorts and I do talk about the trauma responses of the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. There are other trauma responses that I have begun seeing, so I am going to talk about those eventually, but those are the main 4 that people know, at least in that terms. But what people don't often understand is what symptoms are associated with that. So oftentimes, and I'm sorry I'm going on a rant, right? Oftentimes, many adoptees who are considered in the fog, so those that are not fully aware of everything we're talking about, will say, well, my adoption didn't traumatize me. And my response, if I ever respond, because I try not to, is often, well, you may think that, but you're not recognizing the trauma responses that your body is giving you, right? You're not recognizing the symptoms, because while you may think that you're not traumatized, right? Your body, again, your body holds on to that trauma, so you're just doing things without realizing it. So one of those things with, as Nancy Newton-Very is mentioning with anxiety, that is a trauma response. Disassociation, we're going to be talking about that a little bit later, is very common. Chronic illness, super common because it builds up. So like with anxiety, there's other symptoms to anxiety like having stomach issues, right? So it may not just be like panic, like full-on panic disorder, but it could be something as simple as you're having a lot of stomach issues, right? So for me, that was one of the things that my anxiety came up as a child, was I was in and out of the nurse's office all the time in elementary, right? And so I pretty much lived off ginger ale and saltine crackers or Ritz crackers, right? So those were the two things that my nurse always had on hand because she knew that my stomach had a lot of issues. And ironically, even though my mother is wonderful and she's very well versed in all of this, she did not recognize these symptoms in me, right? She didn't put 2 and 2 together. And nor did I, because I was a child, but she didn't recognize the anxiety that I had as a child, right? And like now, we've talked about it, and she's like, I regret not recognizing those symptoms. I wish I could have done more for you. So if you are an adoptive parent, or you're a hopeful adoptive parent, a foster parent, a birth parent, a parent, and you're listening to this, or even, an adoptee, or an adoptee and you're hearing, your adoptee talk about some of these things, we have to recognize that. You could be the adoptee and be like, oh my God, like, this is so me. And that's okay too. I'm not trying to force you out of the fog if you are an adoptee. I'm really not. But it's important to slowly come out of it and realize that adoption in itself causes far more harm legally, physically, mentally, emotionally than it does the good, right? Which is external care. So let's just keep that in mind. All right, sorry I went on a rant with the whole anxiety thing. Let's continue. Traumatic memories lack verbal narrative and context. Rather, they are encoded in the form of vivid sensations and images, according to Herman. A lack of verbal narrative makes memories difficult or impossible to talk about. It would be especially true of adoptees who, at the time of the traumatizing event, were not yet able to speak. But even if the trauma occurred later, when speech has been mastered, the events surrounding the trauma are difficult to put into words. This may be why war veterans seldom talk about the war, or Holocaust victims about the camps. When an experience defies the human brain's capacity to integrate it, it floats around without context in the never-never land of disassociated images, vivid sensations, and puzzling behavior. It is like living in one's nightmare, and no one is immune to trauma, because trauma has the element of surprise. It can happen to anyone, which is extremely true. Not only that, but specific events often cause specific responses in trauma victims. The consequences of trauma are predictable. All right, so with that being said, I know that we tend to get comments about, well, no, like she just said, no one's immune to trauma, or, just because you have trauma from adoption doesn't mean others don't face trauma. That is completely true in that aspect. However, we can minimize adoption trauma, meaning the adoption trauma is specific to adoptees, right? So we can minimize it by having less adoptees face adoption, right? We can minimize, not adoptees, we can minimize the amount of children that have to go through adoption, right? We can minimize the necessity for external care by helping family preservation, which 95% of cases this can happen to, right? We can stop and work with that. In the 5% where it would be necessary with external care, we can again minimize trauma because there's different facets of it. So with adoption, right, there's not just maternal separation. So that's still going to happen if you need external care, unfortunately, right? And again, maternal separation does happen if your mother dies, or maybe in the case of divorce and there's parent alienation, for example. But we can minimize the other parts of trauma from adoption, such as not being genetically mirrored, or losing access to our culture, or losing access to medical information we need that is life-saving, right? So there's other parts of adoption trauma that others do not face because they are not adopted. So that is why many of us, if family preservation is not possible, aim for external care in terms of kinship, fictive kin, and then legal guardianship, because while we recognize trauma will still happen with the maternal separation, it minimizes the other parts of the trauma. All right? So I will see you guys next time talking about the consequences of trauma. And we are going to continue on because this is a very long book with lots of different pieces to it. I hope you guys enjoyed this piece, and I will see you guys next time.